it won't be an issue. It won't pop up. It's not going to pop up. It is not on any lists, hence unlisted. So we did have one question that came in through the week as we were doing our readings in Samuel and in Kings. They said, why, if we went to all the trouble to get a tabernacle, are the people meeting with God on high places during Samuel? Why is Samuel going up to a high place at Ramah to meet with God instead of going to the tabernacle? And one thing I would say to keep in mind is that I think the period of Judges actually stretches into Samuel. I think Samuel is the last judge, so he's the last one that God raises up to deliver Israel from their oppressors and stuff, and so he acts as a hinge point. He's both the last judge and also he's the one who's anointing the king. We'll look a little bit closer at Judges today, and the key phrase in Judges is, in those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that goes on until there's a king in Israel. And then everybody still is kind of doing what's right in their own eyes. So the high places, I think, the way that I understand it is as Israelites moved in, they, instead of tearing down the Canaanite churches, they just co-opted them to worship Yahweh. And sometimes they did so genuinely, and sometimes they did so in a compromising way. So I'll say Samuel, because God continues to meet with him, is probably somebody who, when he goes up to the high place and he's connecting with God, God's honoring that. And they would build their altars on top of mountains so that you could be closer to the gods. Like that was the idea. And the Israelites apparently just kind of co-opt some of that. Sometimes they'll worship idols up there. It'll become a problem for them. It'll be a snare. But then David is also going to start some reforms where we say, hey, we don't go up to the high places to worship God anymore, because as the king, he wants people to walk with God. And later on in the books of Kings, one of the marks of like a really good king is they tore down high places. So they went up on the hills and wrecked them. The other thing to keep in mind too is that there is a distinct difference between the office of a priest and the office of a prophet. So Leviticus is all about priest law and how priests are supposed to approach God. And priests are intermediaries from the people to God. Prophets are intermediaries from the people that takes God's message to the people. So the function is not the same. One is bringing the sacrifices from the people to God, and one is bringing the word of God back to the people and bringing his perspective. And Samuel occupies that second office, although he also is able to, as somebody who's trained in the priesthood, he also is doing priestly things. Again, there are times where when you zoom in real close, you're like, these things are two separate things, but this guy's doing both of them. What's going on? I think Samuel's a transition. I think there's also one that might be more familiar to us is in Acts. There's a transition in Acts between the economies of how God worked in the Hebrew scriptures and how he's going to work in the Christian era. And so not everything that happens in Acts is normal. Some of it is God's trying to say, hey, we're going to do things different, and this is my sign that I'm with this thing that's happening that's new. So does that make sense? Any other questions that popped up for you doing your readings or anything else? Tim?
Was there a reason when King Solomon came into the kingdom that he had all his people executed?
Yeah, he tried not to, and we'll talk a bit about that if I can get that far today. There was very much, once they get into the monarchy, there very much was we're just going to do what everybody else in the nations do. And when there's a transition of power from one king to the next, it was not uncommon for the new king to just kill anybody who might have a rival claim to make sure that he's got his solid thing. Solomon did not want to do that, but there were a couple of coups that were brewing, and he's like, I'm going to give you the opportunity. You choose what you want to do. And they're like, well, we're going to be sneaky. And he's like, well, then you're going to be dead. And that was how that went. So, yeah. Yes? That was Saul, and because he was impatient and paranoid. Yeah, Samuel said don't do that afterwards. Like, Saul should have known better, and Saul did it. He was not from the Levites, so he was not a priest at all, nor was he a prophet. He was a king from the tribe of Benjamin. So when he did that, God was like, yeah, I can't trust you. You were the first king, and so everything you do sets a legal precedent for every king after you. And if you're gonna usurp the way that I said for things to go, which is that priests are the ones who offer sacrifices, then I'm gonna take you off the throne. This is the end of your line. I don't know. There were no highways in the ways that we think of highways, and so it was hard to get to places. And so I think he was waiting for Samuel to show up. Samuel wasn't showing up. I can't send him a text message and say, hey, where you at? What's your ETA? He's just like, well, he's not here, and I need to go to battle, so let me make this offering, and then we'll be able to go. Good. Welcome, welcome. Any questions from homework reading or other things that you've come across?
Is age 30 a thing?
Age 30. So in the Levitical code, Levites couldn't be installed as priests until they were 30 years old. There were times where they bent the rules a little bit, but the standard was 30 years old. And that'll play a huge role. We're going to study Ezekiel together as a church in the summer, and that was a big thing for Ezekiel because he trained to be a priest and then was captured. And so on his 30th birthday, he's out. God, what are you doing here? I trained my whole life for this, now I can't. And then God shows up, which is super cool. Welcome. Any other questions? We've got a lopsided room. I'm going to have to lean this side to. Okay, we're going to start with our table of contents and with our Bible contents. I was not saying that so you knew. I was just making an observation. Oh gosh, look what I've done. I've caused division. All this gets edited out of the video, so it's okay. So that's where we'll pick up today is, yes. I have no idea. It's unlocked. Was it the thick journal-y one? I saw it on Wednesday, and I asked about it, but I don't know where it ended up.
That was when Sophie called about Ashley's battle. She called Laura.
Okay. I wasn't there for that. I don't remember. Yes.
Why is God not very forgiving in the Old Testament?
I think why is God not very forgiving in the Old Testament? I think he is. So, sure. If you like are following and tracking along with the story, like he walked with people in the garden and they still chose to reject him. And so everything he's doing is an extension of grace. Like for the fact that he let anybody continue was a kindness. And now he's called this family out of the world and is now setting them apart as something special. And so this is a project that has never been done before, where creator of the universe decides, I'm going to choose this family to make a kingdom out of, and they're going to walk with me in a special way to show the world what I'm like. And as he invites them into that, they start off saying, yeah, we agree. We'll do everything you say. We'll follow your laws. We'll keep your commandments. And then immediately don't. And so he's in this relationship of like, we said, we had an agreement. Like I told you up front what things were going to be like. And you said you wanted that. And now we're in it. And you're not being faithful to the things that you said you wanted to be. And so if we think of forgiving, if we think of forgiveness as like you can do anything you want and there's never going to come a time where there's consequences for that action, then yeah, like God's not very forgiving. Where in the Christian economy, he's real forgiving until the end of time, at which time he says, all right, all of you guys have, you're either with me or you're against me. He demonstrates that in the story with Israel on a smaller time scale. He says, hey, I need you to do this. Okay, we got it. And then they go and don't do it. He said, well, this is the problem. Yeah. So he's teaching us something. There's consequences to our rejection of God. And I had another thought too. But every time he says, hey, you guys are in the wrong, I need you to change and walk with me, from that time until the time where he actually causes the judgment to come, is all grace. Like, if the garden's any illustration, like, as soon as sin happens, like, we deserve to be zapped. Like, we can't be in the presence of a holy God. And so for him to hold some space for us to make a different choice is grace. And it is a kindness that he continues to do, even in the New Testament economy. So like Romans will say, don't you know that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? Like if you realize, oh, I messed up, like every time, like, and then I get to draw another breath, like I get a chance to make a different decision. Like that's a grace, that's a kindness that God is giving us so that we have the choice to do something different. But if we continue to persist, we harden our hearts against the voice of the Holy Spirit or the voice of God. And he's like, look, if you want to be separate from me, I'll give you what you're asking for. It's just not going to be what you thought it was. So like the Israelites think they want like better harvests and stuff like that, and they know that there's a mechanism that makes sense to them of if I worship this God, Baal, in this way, then all of my crops will be successful. It's a fertility god, so going to church is a lot like having sex with temple prostitutes. And they're like, yeah, I want to do that. That's how I want to worship God, so that I have a fruitful harvest. And God's like, that's not what I said to do. I said to do this. I'll be with you. I'll bless you, but I gave you a way to worship me. You don't get to pick. Does that help give some framework? Okay. It's a good question, and it's one that like persists throughout. Like it's I think of it as like our relationship with the Son. Like God is holy; He is what He is, and He says He burns up sin. Oh wait. Yeah, people get struck down dead for lying about their tithe in church. So, like, it's not that there is no bad stuff that happens. It's just that we have a different framework for approaching. There's an instance where they say, hey, the reason why y'all are getting sick in your church and some of you are dying is because you're taking communion in an improper way. Like, there are consequences to our sin. We just don't get the stories kind of fleshed out in the same way that we get them here, where God's telling and demonstrating His character through a narrative. He's telling the story of what happened. In the New Testament, He doesn't use as many narratives as He uses like didactic texts where He's teaching. Here's the principle, you should do it this way. But there's stories behind that too. So. Well, cool. Let's pray. We're going to start heavy, and hopefully we'll lighten it up as we go. But we got to start in Judges tonight. Sorry, not sorry. Cool. Did you have your hand up? Ehud? Okay, do you want to pray, Ehud? No. Any volunteers? Austin's going to save you, but anybody else want to volunteer? Is this a hand up? Janet? Oh, sorry. All right. Go ahead. All right, let's pray.
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this night. We thank you for those that have gathered here tonight. We thank you for what you do in this place and know that you can continue to do it. Be with those that are not here, Lord. Watch over them. Be with those that are having troubles, Lord. Just do what you got to do, God, but to make it better, as we know that you can. Thank you for everything that you do for us. We just give you the praise and the honor and the glory of everything. In Christ's name,
Amen. Amen. So let's start with our Bible contents chart. You guys have this, maybe. And so this first yellow box will have Genesis in it. What is that? BC 1447. What is that date? Yeah, so underneath BC 1447, you should have an event. There's a specific event that goes there. The Exodus. Yeah, the liberation from Egypt, okay? And then you've got Genesis. All right, I'll go up to the one that's filled in. I just want to make sure that you have that part written down. You can add now, if best case scenario, we'll get there tonight, but in BC 968, the first temple is finished. So you can add that there at the bottom. We've got our Genesis box there. Yes, sir. 4 years before that. 3 or 4 years before that. But it's finished in 968 BC. So we filled out this box, which is Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. And they all fit in between Genesis and our other box. You've got Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Those are 1 month things that happen on either end of Numbers. And then you've got the book of Ruth, which happens in the time of the Judges at some point. We're not quite sure which. And we'll cover that today. But I want to give you this box on top. This box on top is Chronicles. And since we're here, you can put Psalms as the other blue box. So you'll notice that you've got the Torah, the writings, and the prophets are all in different colors on your chart. And so Chronicles, you'll see, kind of covers from Genesis on. It covers a big span, but it's in the writings. It's not in the prophets. So it's less concern. It's just a different genre. He's trying to tell the same story, but it's like the Reader's Digest version of the whole Old Testament. That's what Chronicles is. So in your readings, you jumped between Kings and Chronicles. I would say Kings is trying to tell things in order. Chronicles does tell things in order, but they really zoom in on the stories that they think are important. And so Chronicles is a retelling. If you start reading if you read through the whole Bible and you get to Chronicles, like, just know you're starting over from the beginning again. So that's why on our table of contents we said consecutive history goes down through Kings, right? And then Psalms, I could probably take Psalms all the way back to Exodus, because there are Psalms that Moses wrote that are contained in the book of Psalms, but many of them are written by David, and so he gets a lot of credit for those. Any questions about this section? Those are really easy. And then we will look at... What? Oh, no, we'll do that another time. I mean, you can if you want to. So you've got the Torah is highlighted and the Nevi'im is highlighted, or not highlighted. and the Ketuvim are highlighted, law, prophets, and writings. If you want to, you can go through and you can highlight the rest of the books in the Old Testament as prophets. So whatever color, I've got a green up here, so I'll probably highlight green there, and then Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings are all prophets. I got to zoom in here for you. Yes. I'm so fancy. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. All of these guys are all prophets. What's that? Habakkuk or Habakkuk? Whatever makes you giggle. Okay? Yeah, everything that we haven't highlighted yet, because we highlighted the Torah, the first 5 books, and then we highlighted the writings, which were Ruth, and then Chronicles to Song of Solomon, plus Lamentations and Daniel. And then all the rest of the books are in the prophets.
Joshua is a prophet?
Yes. So they will sometimes group the prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They'll sometimes group those as the former prophets, the prophets that happened first, the former prophets. And then the ones on the other side they'll call the latter prophets. They're the prophets that happened later. If you want to write that in, you can. I don't plan on it. No, I haven't done anything in the New Testament yet. The other thing, I left mine here. I wanted to do some underlining, but I'm not going to get to. So the other thing I would do is I would underline 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and then I'm going to do a dotted underline under all of the real thing you need to see is the dotted underline from Genesis to 2 Samuel. And what that line is going to be for us is the dotted lines are going to be before the temple was constructed. So that would be like our tabernacle era. We built a giant tent. And then in 1 Kings, that's where we get a solid building. We get a temple. So do a dotted underline underneath Genesis through 2 Kings. And then I'm going to go up to the top here. Oop. So at the top, I'm going to put before the temple has a dotted underline on it. Books that are written while the temple is standing have an underline, and then after, I'm going to leave those blank, but I'm only going to give you the before ones. So I'm just making a key for myself so I know what's going on. Does that make sense? The temple ends up being a big deal, in case you haven't picked up on that yet. Okay, the temple ends up being a big marker for the history of Israel. Okay, any questions about table of contents? Anything you need to see again? Yes, ma'am. So the temple was constructed in 1 Kings. So I marked off all of the books that are God relating to people before the temple's on the planet. But God promises to do some very specific things with the temple that mark his relationship with folks in different ways. You would actually call that the first temple period. Yeah, so you'll hear some scholars talk about the first temple period, and then you'll hear them talk about, spoilers, the second temple period. And there's an exile and this exile between them. The third temple they call the Herodian temple or something. So the second temple gets renovated, where they don't really renovate the temple, they renovate the foundation around it. And Herod does that to kind of gain some favor with the Jews. It doesn't go great, but that's what he does. Any questions about that? No. Yeah. Okie dokie. We've got to circle back into Judges. And so what? I'm going to ask you, we're not going to talk about Ehud a ton. I'm going to ask you to open to Judges chapter 1. Do you need a Bible, Ash? Okay. I'm sorry. I'm sure it's around here somewhere. Can you look in the sound booth and see if there's a big leather Bible laying around? Or on the bookshelf in the entryway? I know I saw it on Wednesday, but I left it alone. Okay, so the book of Judges opens, verse 1, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. And so now Judah, so we've talked about Moses leading military campaigns. We've talked about Joshua leading military campaigns. When the text opens with Judah, are we talking about a person? We're talking about a tribe. And so there's an unnamed leader in the tribe of Judah where we don't know who he is or what he does, but now they're going to begin to talk about the different tribes as though they are persons. They are, yeah, so who shall go up for us to fight? Oh, okay. Well, yours is clarifying. So in the Hebrew, it just says, who's going to go up? And they say, well, Judah. God says Judah's going to go up. But Judah is referring to a tribe. And then it'll say, and Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come up with me and fight. And so now in Judges chapter 1, we see these are not actually people. These are tribes now in relationship with one another. But this is the first time that there is no designated individual leader. So Moses was really careful. You can go back through Exodus and Numbers, and there's 7 times where the text will talk about Moses training Joshua to take his job. And then Joshua goes through and he does what he's supposed to do. He leads military campaigns and all of those kinds of things. But he doesn't train up the next generation. He dies without appointing another leader to take over him. So this is where, in your Bible timeline, I've called this period the tribes in confederation. So the Articles of Confederation in the United States were a really, really weak centralized government. Each of the states had their own government, and they were all kind of friends together, but nobody was in charge. And that's why the Constitution was a big deal, because it established the federal government and the state government, which, American history can help us understand something of what's going on here, where they're all tribes, they're all brothers, they're all from the same family, they all now have military capabilities, but there's no one person who's in charge. There's no president. There's nothing going on. And we'll see at the end of the book of Judges, the key phrase is, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So they go through, and if you just look at your headings in your text, my heading says the continuing conquest of Canaan in chapter 1, right? So they continue to fight. Even after Joshua's dead, they continue to fight and they continue to try to take over. I've got a heading over verse 27 which says failure to complete the conquest. Now that's where they'll go through and they'll list all of the little pockets of Canaanites that they did not kick out. They did not kick the people out. They just kind of left them alone. Or they got tired and stopped fighting. They got comfortable back at home wherever they had their tent set, and so they didn't worry about the places that they couldn't reach yet. They kind of compromised. They compromised on what the mission was. And then chapter 2 is going to give you a snapshot of what I call the sin cycle. Question?
To get a better idea of where we're at, this is after the four from last week on the map. This is after the four or kingdoms went and attacked in one area that they promised to give them.
So this is after Joshua. So Joshua led a military campaign. I'm looking at it from your side. A military campaign across the middle, and then he did a southern campaign where all the kings came up and fought him. Then he did a northern campaign and went up and fought a bunch of kings up there. And then he kind of came down and settled. And then from chapter 13 on, they're talking about allotments, and they're dividing up the land between the tribes, but they're not all going to travel together. Whereas when they come in for the conquest, everybody goes, there's a whole army of everybody going together. When they finish Joshua's campaign, now every tribe is responsible to take the rest of what's theirs, and they don't. The Canaanites occupy the whole land. So all of the Hittites, the Jebusites, like that is a Canaanite is a blanket statement that covers all the people who are living in the land. The Philistines are kind of on the coastline, but Canaanite, like you might even call the Philistines Canaanites, although that's kind of imprecise. I don't know that I would do that, but yeah. So they're just people who are occupying in the land that now Israel is coming into, the land that God promised to them. Yes? I don't know that that's necessarily where the compromise is. I don't know that there's a problem that Judah, because Simeon actually only has territory in the midst of Judah. So they just say, hey, you live among us, we share property, why don't you come with us and fight? And they say, yeah, we'll go up with you. So I don't know that that's necessarily what the issue is. But there's no designated leader. We don't know who was leading the tribe of Judah. We just know that Judah as a tribe made decisions to go on this military campaign. And they do all that. They don't finish the land. But then in chapter 2, now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, God said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. And as soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed the Lord there. So God comes and says, hey, I told you to drive these people out, and you didn't. And so now I'm not going to help you fight them. They're just going to be a thorn in your side, and they're going to cause you to stumble. So I asked you to do something. You guys lost your sense of urgency now that you're in the land. And so now I'm just going to let these people persist, and they're going to be a pain in your butt or in your side. It says it kind of. So we'll go back and recount the death of Joshua in these verses here. But they followed, Israel followed God as long as Joshua and the people that Joshua led with were alive, and as soon as they died, they stopped following Yahweh. And all that generation, verse 10, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know Yahweh or the work that he had done for Israel. So how many generations are we out of Egypt? So you got the Exodus generation, what happened to them? They all died in the wilderness. Now you've got the Deuteronomy generation, which is Joshua and Caleb, right? And then you've got a third generation is the judges' generation, where they're like, yeah, I remember they said something about that, but I don't know. So they stop walking with Yahweh. It doesn't matter about the Red Sea crossing, doesn't matter about the Jordan Sea crossing. It's like, oh, mom and dad fought for this land. They talked about it all the time. Now I just live here, This is my life, right? And in verse 11, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and served the Baals. They abandoned Yahweh, the God of their fathers who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands surrounding their enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning, because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned their back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways, so God was angry. And that's a summary of the book of Judges. Like that's the book of Judges is that story over and over and over again. God raises up a judge, or let me find that. This one? They're safe, they're in a safe place, and then that kind of leads to compromise or getting lax, and they begin to reject God and they sin. God sends them into a season of suffering where somebody is oppressing them. They get so overwhelmed that they cry out, they supplicate, they ask God for help, and God sends somebody to save them. And then once they're saved, they get comfortable again. So if you want to use S words, I've got S words here. If you want to use D words, which I like the D words better, they get diluted. Their sense of urgency is diluted. Their commitment to God is diluted, and then they defect. They sin against God. They go after other gods of the land. Then God allows them to be dominated by other things, puts them into some kind of slavery or bondage where they have to pay tax to something else. And then they get desperate, so desperate that they ask God for help, all except for one time. In the last cycle, they never ask for help. But then God raises up a deliverer. And so this is the same cycle 7 times, although I'll talk you through the 7 real quick. But it's not just a spiral. Oh, we just are spinning around in circles. Things will never get better. No, every time you go through, we're actually spiraling down. Things are worse and worse. The players that God has to work with are more and more compromised, and people are less and less committed. So I would be real careful taking any moral principles from the leaders of the book of Judges. And we're not talking about judges of like they sit on a bench and they have a gavel. We're thinking of judges as the name that God gives for these local military commanders who come in and they fight some kind of a battle. So that's a little bit of a different. If you were picturing a guy with like a curly wig, that's not the picture. They're like local military commanders. They each come from tribes and they fight tribal battles. Although they'll all identify themselves as Israelites, most of the oppression is going to be very localized as we go through. So that's the sin cycle. That will be helpful for you for understanding the book of Judges, particularly chapters 3 through 16. So I'll run through those real quick. Yep. Maybe. It thinks I want to comment. I don't want to comment. So you start off with Othniel, and there's almost no details at all about Othniel in chapter 3, verses 5 through 11, except that Othniel is Caleb's brother. Caleb's younger brother is the first judge. Caleb was one of the 12 spies with Joshua who went and spied out and said, hey, we should trust God. And so you see that family line continues to try to follow after Yahweh. Then you get Ehud, and Ehud is Riley's favorite. Ehud fights against Eglon, and he assassinates him. Eglon was a really, really fat guy, and Ehud was left-handed. So he carried his sword on the wrong side when they inspected him for armament, and he asked for a private audience with the king. They granted him that. He stabbed the king in the belly, lost the sword in all the fat, and entrails came out the back, and so he died in a big pile of poop. And when Ehud snuck out, everybody assumed that the king was just relieving himself for a really long time, and so it took them a while to find him before, and then trace after Ehud. So that should just give you a sense of like the kind of like yucky stuff that we're going into in Judges, and it only gets worse. Next you've got Deborah and Barak in 4 and 5, and Deborah is a judge. She sits under a tamarisk tree, and when none of the men are willing to lead, God will use women too. And so she was willing to be faithful, and I don't know that here's where I say I'm not sure that we should say, oh, well, because Deborah was a judge, then we should always let women lead. It's like God had said, I want these men to lead, and they're not doing it, so I'm going to use the people who are willing to do it. It's a compromise situation, and that's where you get the opposing commander of the army, Sisera. He comes through. He's trying to hide, and Jael, a housewife, comes in while he's taking a nap and drives a tent peg through his temple and nails him into the ground. So the women are winning because the guys are off, compromised. And Deborah sings a lot. She's got a song in there. Gideon covers chapters 6 through 8, and that dude is just a straight coward. He asks God for direction. God gives him direction, and he's like, yeah, but did you really mean that I ought to do the thing you said you ought to do? When you open up his story, he is threshing wheat in a wine press. So when you thresh wheat, you go up on a hill and you throw the wheat up and let the wind go away, but he's hiding in a low spot to keep from being detected, like he's hiding. And God says, hey, I need you to go down and tear down the Asherah pole that's in your town. And he's like, okay, I'll go and do it, but he does it at nighttime so he doesn't get caught. And then everybody's like, hey, who did this? And he gets found out. So they call, somebody intercedes for him because he had attacked Baal's altar. They rename him Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend with him. We're not going to attack him, but if Baal wants to go after him, then let Baal do that. And over again, I think God demonstrates his ability to use people who are just terrified all the way through. He's an utter coward. I don't get the feeling that any of the weirdness of the battle, of him breaking jars, and I don't think any of that was strategic. I think he was just trying to figure out how to stay off the battlefield as much as possible. So not a big fan of him. He ends up making an ephod. He makes at the end of his life, he makes a golden shirt, and sets him up. People ask him, okay, will you be king over us? Like, we need a king in Israel. Will you be king over us? He says, no. I won't be king, and none of my sons will be king. But then he names his son Abimelech, and Abimelech means my father is king. So at the end of his life, he ends up his ego's really inflated, and Abimelech is Gideon's son, and he's just straight up entitled. He goes around acting like everybody owes him everything, and he ends up getting tricked. A number of times he gets tricked by speaking rashly, and ultimately he walks too close to a city that he's besieging, and a lady drops a stone out the window and crushes him in the head. So he's kind of jacked up. Jephthah is one of the last ones, and Jephthah is a gang leader. Like he's been kicked out of town. He rolls with some troublesome dudes. So he's a gang leader that in military conflict, they're like, oh, well, maybe we can get this gang leader to lead us, and he'll fight for us. And he's like, you guys better pay me. So you end up with a mafia kind of situation before you get to Samson in chapters 13 through 16. And I will say there's a bright spot in Samson's story that his mom and his dad, I think, were legit wanted to honor Yahweh. They did not know very much. It seems like they were just making the best that they could. But God shows up to them and says, I'm actually going to separate your kid out from before his birth. So he's going to be a Nazirite from before his birth. And a Nazirite is somebody who doesn't cut their hair, they don't touch anything that's dead, and they don't drink any wine or fruit of the vine. I have no idea. It shows up, I think it's in Leviticus, that there's this certain kind of vow that you can take to honor God. But it's one of those things that typically an adult makes the choice of, I'm going to take this vow for a limited period of time. What was unique about Samson is the angel says, hey, you're going to have a kid and he's going to be a Nazirite from birth. So he did not get a choice. And then he throws a hissy fit about it for the rest of his life. He's kind of a spoiled brat. He wants everybody to do what he wants. And through his story, you see him slowly undoing his vow. So he, at a wedding feast, it seems like he's getting drunk at a wedding feast. He ends up tearing things apart, and so is touching dead things. And then the conclusion of his vow is when he lets a lady cut his hair, and at that point, his strength leaves him. I would just say too, when you read the story of Samson, I would picture like beanpole nerd with glasses, because if he was jacked and ripped like the big CrossFit guy, like I don't think anybody would be confused about where his strength came from. But when I picture Samson, I think real like stringy and really thin and lanky, like not a boxer like Ashley, like he was just super weak looking dude who could rip the whole gates off of the city and carry him across a field. But God's with him. So these are the and each of these is worse than the first. So like I think of Samson as really scraping the bottom of the barrel. God's like really just trying to use whoever he can. But those are the seven main judges in Judges. They each have a sin cycle, and there are more in there. But I'm just giving you an overview of this book. Questions? Yes. Donkey's jawbone's real big and heavy. And he was strong. And God was using him. Like, it's real clear that God was using him to defeat and weaken the Philistines and terrorize the Philistines who were terrorizing his people. So. Any questions about sin cycle or about Judges? Because the wheels are going to really fall off. So I'm on iBible Maps. I'm at the index here, and I'm going to look at the conquest of Canaan. And I'm going to click on the tribal allotments for Israel. Can you guys see that? All right, so I'm going to start at the bottom. You've got Simeon at the bottom, who has scattered cities in Judah only, and in Judah. Above them is territory given to Dan, and then Benjamin. Reuben is on the other side of the river. And then Ephraim's above Dan and Benjamin. You've got West Manasseh on this side of the river, and up on the northern side is East Manasseh. So the tribe of Manasseh gets split into two parts, and they have different sections of the city, or of the land. Gad is on that side of the river too. Then up near the top, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Asher, right? Okay, there's that little dot at the top says what? Dan. That's a city, okay? So what Judges chapters 17 and 18 tell are the story of how Dan, whose tribal allotment was down here on the coast of the Mediterranean city, actually end up settling in a city up at the top. So because they have not followed through and followed God, the land that he told them they could have, they're not able to take it. And so what they do is they find a weak city up in the north, they burn that, and they just move in. So they're like, well, we can't follow God, or God's not holding up his end of the bargain, because they steal a Levite and make him like their priest, and they set up a false altar. So they make a cow again and call it Yahweh, and then they move up to the north and like, yeah, we're gonna worship God up here. And so that's the story. I call it Dan's retreat in chapters 17 and 18, where they retreat and then like oppress a weaker people up in the northern part. That's 17 and 18. Yes, in Judges, yep. It's all the way on the opposite side. So the blue is the Mediterranean Sea. River Euphrates is over way far away. They never made it. So this river up the middle is the Jordan River. You have the Sea of Galilee in the middle. Jordan River goes all the way down to the Dead Sea at the bottom. Yes. Euphrates. Mm-hmm. They didn't even get what they were supposed to get here. Because they refused to follow Yahweh. Because they got into the land and they got distracted by the shiny gods of the Canaanites and were like, oh, we like the way that y'all worship better than the way that my dad worshipped. He was so old and crummy. We're going to do these new things. Yes? I do in a book. Yeah. Yes? Well, they were revered in Egyptian worship, and they're coming out of Egypt, and so I think that was just, well, one, that was what they did as soon as they came out. They made the golden calf, and I can think of at least one more that we'll see a golden cow pop up before the end of the story. Well, it was strength. So your harvest is brought in by the strength of the ox pulling the thing, and then you have milk. And there were old Egyptian stories where like the world sits on the back of a cow and stuff like that. So it's just like strength and life, and that actually was your retirement, like for you to be able to have a big collection of livestock. You could pass those on to your kids, and it was long-term investment, long-term wealth building by having cows. Yes, ma'am. Jerusalem? So Jerusalem is there. It's called Jebus. We're actually going to read a story about Jebus right now. And that's the same hill. They did not conquer it in this time. This map here is showing the end of the book of Joshua, where God said they were supposed to take. And they did, and the book of Judges opens up and says they didn't take it. Jebus is a city that's occupied by Canaanites, even up until the end of the book of Judges. David makes a big deal. When David captures it, David's the one who captures it, he makes a big deal about it. But Jerusalem's there. Hebron is there. Hebron has been excavated. Bethel's been excavated. I think Shechem has, and Shechem is where the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle are going to get set up. Once they get into the land, they seem to set it up in Shechem. And then Hatzor has been excavated, and Dan has been excavated too. I've been to Dan. I've got pictures from Dan, and it's really, really beautiful in February anyway. Yeah. Okay, so most of the book of Judges is in some kind of a chronological order, except for the last chapters, 19 through 21, and we're going to look at those together. So I'm going to flip. This is perhaps the worst story in the Bible. I would, in chapter 19 and verse 1, in those days when there was no king in Israel, I would underline no king in Israel. Let's see if I can find another one. I know, and at the end of chapter 21, verse 25, is like the theme statement for the whole book. This phrase is showing up a bunch, but I don't have them marked out. But in those days, there was no king of Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So Judges 21:25 is the theme for all of the book of Judges. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, I'm in chapter 19, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for some 4 months. So the story opens up. We've got a Levite kind of wandering around, and we've got a compromised Levite, because apparently he has a wife, but he takes a concubine. Which Levites had to marry within Levitical families, so he's marrying outside of his family, and he also has multiple wives. And apparently she was not very upstanding, because she left him, or he was not a very good guy. She left him and went back to her father's house and stayed there for 4 months. So he goes to get his concubine, and is apparently really, really unpersuasive, because his dad keeps like getting him drunk and making him stay another day, getting him drunk and making him stay another day, getting him drunk and letting him stay another day. Again, a Levite, somebody who was supposed to be working for the tabernacle and interceding for God's people. Like, this is like normal lifestyle for them. And finally, his dad has done this, or his father-in-law has done this the last time. And in verse 10, the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite of Jebus, that is Jerusalem. So he's outside of the city of Jebus. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And when they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and they had a servant there too. So the servant said to his master, "Come, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." So he says, hey, let's go stay the night in the Canaanite city. His master said, "We will not turn aside to the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah." Gibeah is a city in the tribe of Benjamin. So he says, the servant says, "Let's stop here for the night. It's right here." And he says, "No, we're not going to stay with the Canaanites. We're going to go back to where the family is. We're going to go stay in Israel. We'll go back to Benjamin, and we'll stay in Gibeah." And he said to this young man, "Come, let us draw near to one of the places and spend the night in Gibeah," or Ramah. So they passed on and went on their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, and they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. So he walks in. "I came to this people because they're part of my family," and nobody comes out and meets them at the gate, and nobody shows them any hospitality, so they're just going to sleep out in the street. "And behold," verse 16, "an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim," so not from the city, but he was sojourning in Gibeah. "The men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, 'Where are you going, and where are you from?' And he said to them, 'We're passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went down to Bethlehem in Judah, and am going now to the house of the Lord. But no one is taking me into his house.' So I come in as the pastor, I come in as the preacher, and no one's even showing me respect, although I'm a Levite." So like there's some kind of a cultural understanding where he's like a little bit frustrated. "We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servants, and the young men with your servants. There is no lack of anything." So he's saying, I'm not even asking for them to feed us. I brought everything with me. I just need a place to sleep. And the old man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in this square." So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. So he's got one old guy who is from the same tribe that they end up connecting with here in Gibeah, right? We tracking so far? Okay. "As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, 'Bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him.' And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, 'No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly, since this man has come into my house. Do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man do not do this outrageous thing.' But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as the morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, until it was midnight. And her master opened up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, 'Get up, let us be going.' But there was no answer. So he put her on her donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home." She did. She either dead or so abused that she's unresponsive, she's unconscious. So we're dealing in a time where medical care was not great. Like the best they could do is give you a shot of whiskey, to be honest. So, do the threads of this story sound familiar? Where have we heard this story before? Sodom and Gomorrah. So that was Abraham was interceding for the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, the last city that we heard act this way. What happened to the last city we heard act this way? Sulfur got burned down, the whole city got nuked, right? Okay, this is in Israel. This is with God's people. This is with the people who knew, like, should have known the way that things ought to be. He even avoided spending the night with the Canaanites in order to be in an Israeli town, and this is what happened. They wanted to know the man, and he's like, no, don't do that. Let me give you my virgin daughter and my concubine. Like, that seems like a better thing. And they knew her all night long, but apparently did not stop until she's dead. And he comes up and opens the door and says, all right, get up, let's go. And she can't respond. So he put her on a donkey and went home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her, limb by limb, into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened, or has been seen from the day of this people Israel come up to the land of Egypt until this day. Consider, take counsel, and speak. So he takes his dead concubine and chops her up into 12 pieces and sends a piece to every, like, capital city of the tribes.
Why would he send out 12 if Benjamin was one of the tribes and not somebody's trying to sell?
I think it's a notice of everybody we'll actually see this again. Saul's going to use the same method with a cow, but I think it's a summons.
So even though it's the tribe of Benjamin, he's mad about it.
He's specifically frustrated with Gibeah, a city in Benjamin.
Oh, okay.
But he's going to call everybody to council to talk about what just happened, right? So, again, I reiterate, this is the worst story in the Bible. I hate it. But, like, if we go through, like, we're only 4 or 5 generations away from Exodus. And this is how far the people have walked away from following Yahweh. Like, when we talk about why isn't God nicer, like, the people were ruthless and wicked. Like, they had completely walked away from what God wanted for them. And he will, and when you read it, we will read something like, they rejected Yahweh and they worshiped the Baals. And we're like, so what? Big deal. They have a different religion. Like, isn't every faith valid? But he's like, no, like, the way that they were worshiping was corrupt and ruthless and wicked and violent towards outsiders. Like, it was nothing of how I wanted my people to reflect my character. But wait, there's more. Then all the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead, so across the river. And the congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah, and the chiefs of all the people, all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in the assembly, 400,000 men on foot that drew the sword. Now the people of Benjamin had heard that the people of Israel had gone up to Mizpah, so they got the message, but apparently didn't come. And the people of Israel said, tell us, how did this happen? So tell us what happened. He tells them what happened. Then in verse 8, and all the people arose as one man, saying, none of us will go to his tent, none of us will return to his house. But this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. And we'll take 10 men and 100 men throughout all the tribes of Israel. So we're going to go and we're going to fight against these. In verse 11, so all the men of Israel gathered against the city, united as one man. And all the tribes of Israel sent through all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, what evil has this taken place among you? Now therefore give up the men, the worthless fellows in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel. But the Benjamites would not listen to the voice of their brothers, the people of Israel. So Benjamin got a summons and said, look at what's happening in your city. You need to turn them over so that justice can be done. And they say, no, we're going to fight for them. We're going to defend what they did. Then the people of Benjamin came out together. I would say, I would take note in verse 15, you've got 26,000 men plus 700 men from Gibeah. So we learn in these verses that the 700 men in Gibeah who can fight, they actually are really skilled slingers. So they're exceptional in battle, And perhaps that's why Benjamin was like, no, we can't kill off the Gibeonites because they're actually really good archers. Like, we should not kill them. But you've got 26,700 men, and in verse 17, 400,000 men from the rest of Israel. 400,000 versus 26,000. Right? How do we expect this to go? Terrible. Do you have a question? Okay. Verse 19, the people of Israel arose in the morning and encamped against Gibeah, and the men of Israel went out to fight. Verse 21, the people of Benjamin came out of Gibeah and destroyed on that day 22,000 of the men of the Israelites. But the people took courage and again formed the line of battle in the same place where they had formed it on the first day. And the people of Israel went up and wept before the Lord. And they inquired of the Lord, shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, go up against them. So 400,000 to 26 or 27, and they lose. They say, hey, God, should we do this again? And he says, yep, go for it. In verse 27, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, who ministered before it in those days, saying, shall we go out once more to the battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them in your hands. So they get beat 2 days in a row. And God says, all right, tomorrow we're done. So they go up and they fight. In verse 35, the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel. The people of Israel destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin that day. So all these were men who drew the sword. So the people of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. So the battle took 3 days by God's design. It's a great question. I think we think that our sin has no consequences for anyone but ourselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. He says, no, he doesn't say I got you. He says, go fight. So he said, the people are going to be a thorn in your side. I'm not going to be with you. I'm not going to defeat your enemies anymore. And so now you guys are going to fight together, and I'm not on anybody's team. Y'all sort it out. So God's taken his hand off of these. Like when you read Joshua, you're like, man, they're just steamrolling everybody. You read Judges, and you're like, they can't swing a sword to save their life. Because God's taken his hand off of them. He's not walking with them. He does not sanction the things that they're doing. Even when they're trying to correct what's right, he's not with them. But now they have a problem in chapter 21, and I'll do this real quick. Oh, man, we're not going to get through this. The men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, none of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. So they just went through and wiped out all of the eligible young bachelors who could swing a sword and all of the slingers. They just killed them all in Benjamin. So now there's a bunch of widows, and there's a whole bunch of ladies who don't have any prospective husbands because they've not only have they killed all these Benjamites, they've also vowed we will not enter into a marriage relationship with them. And so they're like, what do we do? And their solution, they asked the question in verse 8. They said, what one is there of the tribes of Israel that did not come up to the Lord at Mizpah? So they say, well, who didn't come and make that vow? And behold, no one had come from the camp of Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. For when the people were mustered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead were there. All right? So, oh, cool. There's somebody here who didn't make that really harsh vow. So the congregation sent 12,000 of their bravest men, and there commanded them, go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, and also the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman that is lain with a male you shall devote to destruction. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with him. And they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. So they go and steal 400 virgins by decimating this city. Where does it say it? Verse 14, Benjamin returned at that time. They gave them the women whom they had saved alive from the women of Jabesh Gilead, but they were not enough for them. So they steal 400 by burning their homes to rectify this rash vow that they've made. And now they got to figure out what to do. because they still don't have enough. They still don't have enough women. So verse 19. So they said, "Behold, there's a yearly feast of the Lord at Shiloh, which is in the north of Bethel, on the east side of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem. And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, Go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyard and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh and go into the land of Benjamin." So they say, well, we promised that we would not give our daughters willingly in marriage, but now we're going to sanction you to kidnap them. So when they go up to church, when they go up to festival, when they come out dancing, you can sneak out and grab them and take them home, and we won't follow you. Is it?
They said, like, it's basically saying, hey, can I steal your daughter? Okay. I said I was going to trust you in the first place, but sure.
Yeah. So that's the book of Judges. People of Israel departed from there every time, every man to his tribe and family. They went out from there, every man to his inheritance. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So that's what you should take away. Is it good for everybody if we all do what's right in our own eyes? No, not a good idea. You also have a story of Ruth, which happens, if you look at Ruth chapter 1, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And I would actually I would rather call Ruth Naomi, because it's the story of Naomi. Naomi is the one who grows the most and learns the most in the thing, but Ruth is her friend. So the big mechanism in Ruth is what's called a kinsman redeemer. So Naomi loses her right to run her property, and God provides a way through Ruth for Naomi to be restored. But it's a beautiful story of compassion. It's a beautiful story of God showing up in dark times. It's hard because God empties Naomi's hand. He takes everything she loves from her, and then puts Ruth in, and then Boaz, and then children after that. So there's a story of redemption in Ruth too, and there's just one little bright spot in the period of Judges, and that's the book of Ruth. Right? Yeah, we'll do that in a minute. I'm not there yet. Okay, so 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. Samuel's story starts off with his mom praying fervently. She's barren. The priest, Eli, at the time, thinks she's drunk. He does not have any discernment whatsoever. He's not a great guy. Again, I would remind you that I would say that this period of Judges extends into the book of Samuel. So you should think of a compromised people, everybody kind of just doing what's right in their own eyes, and God beginning to work some redemption out of that. And he starts with a mother's prayer, a barren mother's prayer, which I think is perhaps a story that does not get enough limelight. But that's where he starts. And so God answers her prayer, gives her a child, and she dedicates him to the Lord. So he's now in tabernacle service. Eli is the high priest, and his sons were doing the offerings, but they were taking the fat portions that were supposed to be God's, and what they were burning was kind of like the leftovers. So they were corrupt, and they were just getting fat off of people's worship. And God gets a hold of Eli and says, like, you gotta fix your boys, or you guys are out. And Eli does nothing. So really interesting study. When we did 1 Samuel, instead of focusing on David, I actually wanted to focus on the fathers in 1 Samuel and how they don't, like, they're just completely hands off. You just kind of get the picture that they don't engage at all in parenting their kids, like they just let everything happen. Yeah, super duper passive. And yeah, there's a lot of family dynamics in 1 Samuel. But Eli's the high priest. He has awful sons. The Lord begins to speak through Samuel. He calls Samuel and delivers his message that Eli's not going to be the priest anymore through Samuel, this young boy. But you probably think of when you think of he's serving the Lord, we think of a building. It wasn't a building. He was at the tabernacle, and the tabernacle was set up in Shiloh. So we've got tents and stuff. I'm just trying to give you a better picture of what's going on here. And then Samuel begins to speak on God's behalf. He is not only trained as a priest, but he also becomes and serves as a prophet. And there's a battle at Ebenezer, and where the Philistines have come to fight against the Israelites, and they say, well, we need God on our side, so let's get the Ark of the Covenant and we'll bring it to the battle, and then we'll definitely have victory, because that thing is so holy, like, it'll definitely give us good luck. Like, that's the presence of God. And so they begin to use the Ark as though it were an idol. And God's like, yeah, no, I don't do that. And he lets them get defeated unless the Ark get captured. So now the presence of God has literally been taken out of the nation of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant, which is where his presence was supposed to reside, gets taken into Philistine territory. And so in chapters 5 and 6, you've got a judgment against Dagon. So the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And they wake up in the morning and their idol has fallen over next to it. And they're like, oh, that was a mistake. That's weird. I've never seen that happen before. And they stick it back up and they come back the next day and it's fallen over and its hands are broken off. So it's just like showing that Yahweh is superior over whatever deity that they want, that they are worshiping. And they're like, what do we do? And so they actually start making up random stuff to try to placate Yahweh. They make golden tumors and they make golden mice. And they're like, God didn't ask for any of that, but they're just pagans trying to figure out, how do we placate this God because he's so angry? They finally decide, we can't keep this thing anymore. We got to send it back. So they put it on a cart and they say, if Yahweh wants to go home, he's going to have to tell these cows where to go. And the cows just walk straight down the road to Israel. And so the Israelites in Beth Shemesh, they come out one day and there's these cows walking down the road with the Ark of the Covenant on the back. They're like, what do we do with this? But when they realize what it is, they apparently don't show it the same kind of respect. So they look at it, which you're not supposed to do. They take the covering off and they look at it out in the open, and so 700 of them get struck blind, and they're like, we can't keep this thing either. So they send it to a guy named Abinadab in Kiriath Jearim. He gives it the proper respect and the proper honor, and he holds it, and as long as it's in his household, he's blessed. Like, his farms grow, his people are blessed, and so it becomes a blessing for him, but everybody else is terrified to touch it. Because God says, I'm holy, you're going to treat me the way that I told you to treat me. Y'all have all forgotten what I said in the Torah. You've all forgotten all of the ways that I said you need to approach this nuclear reactor, which is my presence, which will be the source of your blessing. But because you are ignorant and you refuse to follow me, like, I'm going to end up burning you guys all up, right? So it's in this section in chapter 8 that Israel demands a king. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. And the name of the firstborn was Joel, and the name of the second Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons, so Samuel's sons, did not walk in the ways but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. So Samuel apparently learned Eli's parenting style, and Samuel's kids were all jacked up too. And all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you're old, and your sons not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done. From the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them to show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So they say, we want to be like all the nations. All the nations have kings. That must be what our problem is. We need a king. Will you give us a king? And Samuel's like, why? Why do we need a king? I would say make a note of Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verses 14 through 20 in this section. So when it says, obey their voice, you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. Now, remember, Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law to the second generation of Israelites. And in Deuteronomy, in chapter 17, God says through Moses, when you get settled in the land and when you appoint a king, this is what the king is supposed to do. He's not supposed to have a bunch of chariots. He's not supposed to have a bunch of wives. And the first thing he's supposed to do when he's installed is he's supposed to copy, by hand, make a transcription of the book of my law. So your kings need to know me the way that I've revealed myself in the Torah. Moses gives some instructions for what that's going to be like. That's, I think, what Samuel is supposed to tell them. But what Samuel told them all the words of the Lord, and the people were asking for king. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. I think he took that and was like, so this is how all this is going to go bad. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be horsemen and run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, some to plow his ground and some to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipments of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. You only have to pay temple tax, but now you're going to have to pay tax to your king, and you're going to pay not only with your money, but also with your not only with your resources, but also with your kids. This isn't God's going to give you what you're asking for, but it's not going to be what you want. And the Israelites are like, yeah, that's what we want. Give us that. He's like, okay. And then he chooses a man from the tribe of Benjamin. What do we know about Benjamin? There was a whole thing in Judges about how Benjamin not only tolerated corruption, but defended corruption when confronted about it. And God's like, I'm going to give you a king, and your first king is going to come from Benjamin. Oh, cool. Great. Except that everybody looked at the guy and said, man, he's really tall and handsome. Like, that's exactly what we were looking for. That's so great. I'm excited about this. Like, yes. And everybody kind of goes home. But there's no palace, there's no tax collecting system, there's no government. Like, he's got to make everything up. And so it's not until there's a battle that Saul, who's been appointed the king, who, by the way, did not want it, like went and hid when he figured out this was what was going to happen. And they had to drag him out and make him king. So he starts off his reign like, no, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. And then as soon as he's threatened by another person who could do his job, as soon as God says you can't do it anymore, he grabs onto it. And from that point, you see him clinging to his spear as though it's his symbol of authority as you read through the rest of the book. On your own time, not tonight. So there's a battle that comes up, and Saul's like, how do I get everybody's attention? So he cuts up a cow in 12 pieces and sends it off to the different tribes. They all come and they're like, what is this? And he's like, it's a cow. It was not a girl, but I needed you guys to come and help me fight. Let's go fight. And so he leads the people into battle. They're like, hey, this king thing is kind of nice. We won this battle. That's great. And so at that point, he has a victory in chapter 11. But in chapter 12, Samuel retires. So Samuel's like, you guys, I served you guys. You didn't want my kids. I gave you a king. Now it's time for me to peace out. And he gives a reckoning. He says, who did I steal something from? Like, you guys tell me what I did wrong. And everybody's like, no, you were great. And he's like, great. Leave me alone now. Thank you very much. Like, grumpy old man. Say again? No, he retires. He's not dead yet. He's not going to die until chapter 25. Okay, so Samuel retires in chapter 12, and then Saul tries to fight the Philistines. And in fighting the Philistines, he gets impatient and he gives an unlawful sacrifice. I guess he called, this is what you were saying. I misunderstood you. I'm sorry. He calls for Samuel to come and give an offering so we can figure out what God's going to do. Like, should we go and do this fight or not? He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So his army is now leaving. So he's king in title, but he can only do as much as the people are willing to let him do. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and said, Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattering from me and that you did not come within the days appointed and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God with which he commanded you, for then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So he said, I wanted to honor God. I needed God's favor, and so the way that I got God's favor was by doing the opposite of what God said I was supposed to do. And God's like, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. That's not the kind of thing that we're going to do. We're gonna find people who want to follow me and are willing to obey me when I've given them instructions. Saul, you're not that guy. You're out. Deuces. He's still king, but now God's going to raise up somebody else. And yes, because he was not a priest, not a Levite, not a priest, like does not have the authority to do that. He wanted the Lord's favor in the battle, so he's offering a peace offering to say, like, God, aren't we on good terms? And God's like, we were until you gave me this. Like, you were not authorized. You were not the one who was supposed to bring this to me. I needed a priest to do it, and you wouldn't wait for Samuel. And it seems like as soon as he is done, Samuel walks in and is like, what is all this? And I guess couldn't wait 10 minutes. Had a rest stop. There was a Buc-ee's on the way. And then from there on, you'll just see Saul kind of just becomes this bumbling idiot where he goes out to war. He makes these big rash vows. He vows to, like, if anybody eats, then I'm going to kill the person who eats. And his son, like, on the way eats some honey. And they're like, oh, you weren't supposed to do that. Didn't you hear about the vow? He's like, no, I didn't hear about the vow. And Saul's like, I'm going to kill you. And they're like, he's the best warrior out here. Like, you're not going to kill him. And so, like, Saul just is incapable of leading and is just a bumbling idiot. Because, again, the Lord has left him. And then he, again, goes out against the Amalekites. There's a word I'm looking for. I'm looking for the name of the king. Agag. He took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive and devoted to destruction all the people at the edge of the sword. So God sends Saul out to fight against the Amalekites, and he says, these guys are korban. These guys are devoted to destruction. The same way that Jericho was devoted to destruction, the Amalekites are supposed to be devoted to destruction. And Saul goes and fights and wins and keeps the king alive and also keeps all the livestock. Now, who was the last person who took something from something that was dedicated to korban? This is beginning of Joshua. We did it real quick. Achan. Help for some bacon. His name's Achan. So he does the same thing that Achan did. Achan ended up underneath a pile of rocks with all his family. Saul ends up, nope, now you're done. I'm going to remove the kingdom from you. I desire obedience rather than sacrifice. I told you to burn everything and you kept something back. And so you're done here. We're done. I don't have that off the top of my head. I don't know. And he's still king. So he still has the office, but now God is, in chapter 16, going to appoint somebody new. And we'll, I guess, talk about that next week. I'll make two more observations. So you've got our backstory for Saul is the end of Judges and the tribe of Benjamin. Our backstory for David is the story of Ruth. So the story of Ruth ends with a genealogy where it says David was the great-great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz. Great-great-great. So you've got, in the period of Judges, you've got both kings are set up. One is Benjamin, not great, and one is Ruth. Everybody loves Ruth, and Boaz. Like, who doesn't love Boaz? Oh my gosh. The other thing I'll point out at this point is the king of the Amalekites that Saul kept back. His name was Agag. And way down the line, there's going to be a queen called Esther who has to deal with a guy named Haman, who's the enemy of the Jews, and he is an Agagite. An Agagite. So he is descended from the king Agag, the Amalekite, whom Saul didn't kill, all the way back here. God, thanks for your word. Lord, I pray that you would help us to know you better. God, there's parts of the story that are incredibly painful to read, much less to have experienced. And God, I'm over and over astonished that you continue to pursue us. We're tempted at times to put our sin up against the sins of these people. And Lord, I am reminded often that my heart too is tempted to wander away and to find other lesser gods to worship. So Lord, I pray that you would help us to be faithful to you. I pray that you would raise up leaders that we can trust and we can follow, and ultimately that all of those would point us to you, to Jesus, that you'd return as our King. Look forward to that day, and until then, would you help us to navigate what you put before us? In your name we pray. Amen. Woo! Go team. Hmm? Samuel said, bring here to me Agag, king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him cheerfully. Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. And Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilead. and then Samuel went home. I think that's going to be the beginning of 2 Samuel where they'll give dates. Well, now I got to introduce David. We got to talk about him. I got to do David and Solomon and the beginning of the divided kingdom and get as many other kings as I can next week. I don't know how I'm going to do that. We'll figure it out. Well, I don't have time for that.